Hey y'all, pull up a seat at our table for the next serving of Biscuits and Sunshine. I'm Callie.
And I'm Landra. It makes me hella happy to have you here with us. We're recording this from Distance 4 Audio Studios in Athens, Greece. Welcome to episode 14, Deca Tessera. Bame. Let's go.
I feel like this episode has been a long time coming, and we've both sort of been feeling our way through this topic recently.
That is so true. So today we're talking about the topic of vulnerability. We both believe it's something that's really important to living an authentic life, and yet not always the easiest thing to do.
I hate it. I really hate it. I understand it serves a purpose. It's so hard for me.
Tell me how you feel about vulnerability, Callie.
Oh, I hate it. Kind of like hiking.
Oh.
But I did read an article this morning. No, that's a lie. I read a headline that talked about how hiking has such great benefits for mind and body. And I thought, yeah, right. I kept scrolling.
Well, isn't that funny? That is actually, you can see the similarities between that and vulnerability.
Oh, stop. That's not why I brought it up. Okay.
Well, I'm glad that we could find the humor in this, because this topic does feel like it could be like, oh my God, it's so heavy.
Yeah, but it's sort of messy in a way, you know?
It is.
Like life.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it was a way in is we can, talk about what our relationship has been with vulnerability. And I could start.
That'd be great.
Yeah. I'll be vulnerable. I'll take the jump. I don't think the world is set up for us to really practice vulnerability.
Agreed.
And I don't know if this comes from being the first child, but I always felt like I had to have it all together, to be the good girl, to, I don't know, never like share anything that made me feel exposed. And I think as life marched on, I was really good at I don't know, just holding things inside and not ever sharing anything that felt too vulnerable, something I hadn't already worked through.
Mm.
Yeah. So, and I think though that later as you go on in life, there are these things that happen and it feels vulnerable. It feels scary. And it's like, thinking about a circle of who feels comfortable to share things with. And it's interesting, the older I've gotten in life and the more these opportunities that present themselves, it's given me more opportunities to practice vulnerability. I am not perfect at it. It still makes me sweat. It makes me sometimes sick to my stomach. But I know in the spirit of, like we talked about, living authentically, in the spirit of being able to not shoulder the burden of tough life things all by myself, being vulnerable when I've practiced it, actually, whoa, there's some beauty that comes from it. And yes, so I see the value in it. And I think it's just something that it's so great to talk about, that other people, thinking of specifically younger people, younger women, the more that we could talk about this, the more that we can model this, I think if it can save somebody heartache and give some people the courage to speak their truth and be more vulnerable, then that's what this is in service of for me.
I respect that. I'm going to dodge the question altogether and point us in the direction of vulnerability guru Brené Brown, who says that vulnerability is necessary for life because it's the birthplace of joy and creativity and belonging and love and connection, all these things that as human beings we seek very naturally.
Yes.
And in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be really and truly seen. And that's what vulnerability is. Allowing another human being to see who we are. And maybe even having the courage to live a life where we tell that authentic truth every day to the people who matter.
Yeah.
And that's terrifying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, when you say that, this isn't like a strip emotionally naked to everyone. We
Correct.
have to be really strategic, I guess is the word, but also really discerning. That's a better word. Thoughtful. Who are the people that are worthy of me sharing? And these are the folks in my experience that have your back, that are really in a place of loving you, that it is safe to show maybe the not so beautiful parts.
Yeah, it is, truly. And if we're lucky enough, we get a handful of those people in life. I feel like in some respects, I have more than a handful, and I count that as some of probably my biggest blessings, those people in that
Mm-hmm.
group. Because it's people who will hold space for you to celebrate or to commiserate or just to be silent and then reflect back to you the things that you've said in your best days.
Mm.
I think that's who deserves your vulnerability. And those relationships can be built over time. They can be instantaneous for some people, but it's knowing and discerning who is in that sort of circle. I think that's a good sort of indication of who to be vulnerable with.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, when you said that about different groups of people, I think one thing I've always looked at is just thinking about over time, do words and actions match? Because it's easy to be there for the good times, and so I'm always looking for consistency in how they show up, if that feels like a good kind of environment, if you will, to be vulnerable.
Absolutely. For me, my experience with vulnerability is probably one as a child that I had no issue with. And then as I started to get out in the world on my own, I had a series of experiences that sort of told me, well, nope, can't, nope, not, nope, like a pinball machine almost bouncing back
Mm.
and forth from emotional damage, just from different things and different experiences. And I remember in my 20s, my mom, the woman is so intuitive. My mom would always say to me, you don't forget that you do need to be vulnerable, especially if it came to relationship. And I'd be like, yeah, mom, yeah, I'm vulnerable. Well, I think what I thought I was doing was not being vulnerable. It was just sort of a calculated sharing. But
I can relate to that. Yeah.
you never really allow someone to see who you are because it's too scary.
Mm-hmm.
But you allow certain things to be shared. And maybe this is a good time to talk about the difference between vulnerability and just sort of oversharing.
Mm.
Because you can sit down with someone and sort of trauma dump all of these experiences and all of these things on them, but it doesn't come from an authentic place of wanting to be seen. Because sometimes we can share these deep, dark secrets, and that can be bids for attention. It can be bids for like, I need your love, but it's not from a place of, I want you to see who I am.
I like that distinction a lot.
I think it took me a little while to understand the difference between the two. And definitely took me a while to understand with whom it's safe to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I meet new people and I find myself sort of being very scared on the inside to say, okay, if this happens, my experience tells me the reaction I get in return will be this. It will be bad. But then when something happens and the reaction I get is totally different. It's compassionate. It's no big deal. Life is messy. And in that moment, my brain starts to rewire and maybe like twitch a little bit. But I know that in that moment, I can give in to the fact that, okay, this person does deserve more of my actual vulnerability and to actually see who I am. Brené Brown says, what makes you vulnerable also makes you beautiful. Isn't that gifts of imperfection? No one is perfect.
Oh
and
my God, 100%.
It's our imperfections that make us who we are.
So true. I mean, I bring up often social media, but I just think about that so much of how it is showing the beauty, the like perfection, right? But then, and I'll share that I recently shared a post personally after my shoulder surgery, talking about how hard it's been mixed with emotional grief. And it was a way, like you were talking about that, and it was really an authentic share, I thought, in a way that I wanted to not only document it for myself, but also as my way to start to tiptoe into showing parts of my life that are not always so beautiful or what, we put in quotation marks beautiful, because the beauty really is the full gamut of the highs and the lows. And I was amazed at the amount of love and support that came back out of that. And actually, no, not doing it for likes, but surprisingly, it did have like a lot of like engagement there. And so for me, the learning was like, and I know this about, vulnerability. This is where the connection comes in, and the space of like in which that like created conversation between people that I just hadn't talked to in a long time. That time had passed, but we were able to get into some deeper stuff, was like, aha. So that was a good reminder of like, yeah, life is messy and there is beauty in that.
I don't think we hear the narrative enough that despite our imperfections, despite the messiness of life, despite the mistakes we make, and maybe even in spite of those, we are worthy of love. We are worthy of connection, and we are worthy of belonging.
Mm-hmm.
That's at the core of our vulnerability as well. And when you allow yourself to be vulnerable and you give someone else the same in return, what you're saying is, I do deserve love. I do deserve a sense of belonging. I do deserve to make connection. And what a great gift that is.
Yeah.
To give to someone who truly deserves it.
And it's also to say like, hey, look, I'm human.
Yeah.
I'm human having a human experience, and it's just not the most perfect one. And then to still be connected with, I think is really beautiful too. So I'm also thinking about, because I think this could be different for different people. I'm asking the question of you, but also of me in the moment, is like, what makes you feel vulnerable? Like, what are the topics? What are the things? Because I think it can be, right? Am I right? It could be different for all of us.
100%. For me, setting boundaries makes me feel so vulnerable.
Mm.
And I think that's probably why I'm so, especially as a younger person, I was so bad at setting boundaries. Because as an Enneagram 2, okay, let's just get into it all the way. I'm an Enneagram 2. And so like my core fear is a sense of like being unlovable.
Oh, okay. Because I wasn't sure what that was. Okay.
So if I set a boundary, if like everything I do is sort of arranged in a way to make sure that I feel a sense of love, if I set a boundary and someone rejects that boundary, well, then I'm unlovable. I'm unworthy of love. So it's like a combination. Like boundaries were very hard for me in sort of my first 2 decades of life. I think in my 30s, I've sort of like found a sweet spot. But in addition to boundaries, I think communicating needs is also very vulnerable for me.
I like that you brought up boundaries. That's a good one. And that's a whole nother podcast I think we should take note of.
Yeah, I'll write that down.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, emotions.
Yeah.
Being able to speak about my emotions has been one that feels very vulnerable. So it's when I'm not okay, when I feel less than, like you said, perfect, yeah, like the more challenging emotions. I also think it's though on the flip side, the emotions of like when it's a new relationship, when I've been like the I love you, and there's been times and a time when I was like, I'm just diving into this, and the return on investment of doing it, kind of what you talked about earlier about like rewiring the brain to go, oh, this isn't as scary as I thought. This isn't as big of a deal.
One of the things that research says is that vulnerability is at the core of fear, anxiety, shame, like all of these difficult emotions. So I think if you guys out there are struggling with, what makes me feel actually vulnerable, I think it might be a good sort of practice to figure out what scares you. Where does the shame lie? Like what causes anxiety in your life?
Mm-hmm.
And see if being vulnerable about these things is something that you have people in your life that you can share it with them.
Mm-hmm. I think, that's a good point, is being able to pinpoint for yourself. So then you can name it. In mindfulness and meditation, we talk about this with these like negative emotions we experience. You gotta name it to tame it. And
I love that.
Right. And so number one, I think the naming of it is powerful for me too. And then to speak it to another, that and I think Brené Brown does talk about this with the shame piece. It like really, it disempowers it. It takes it away in a way from like that thing. But then it didn't, as for an individual, then it feels more empowering for me in a way too. And I think really then when you're able to speak to another, it allows somebody to contribute to you. And when I think about how we're wired for connection, if, like, for example, if you're telling me like, oh my God, I'm really struggling here. And here's what I am like, well, number one, I feel like, wow, I feel so, I guess grateful is the word, or just honored that you are able to share that with me. And okay, maybe it's like do nothing, but maybe it's an opportunity for me to then somehow help out. And we are all wired for connection. We all want to help in some regards. So you didn't say this, but I could see sometimes how people can feel like, and I know I've been there, like, oh, I'm a burden, especially with this injury that I just had of like, oh, but no, it's been like, this has been a practice in vulnerability of like, this is a time I need help. So I've just like pulled off that vulnerability bandage in this situation. And it's been so nourishing, honestly. And it takes an edge off as well, too, where I'm just like, oh, just relax into this. Relax into this, meaning it is in the discomfort that's already there. So it just didn't add like this extra layer of toughness on.
Oh, there's so many things I have in my mind to say. But this idea of being a burden, I'm so hyper aware of being a bother to people. And to being a burden to people. And I think sometimes it takes my friends or like partners several rounds of having this conversation. You're not a burden. You're not bothering me before I start to sort of settle into not feeling that way in relationship. Like I have no idea where that comes from, but I hate it when I recognize like, oh, I don't want to call because I don't want to bother. I don't want to interrupt. I don't want to do these things. When we're friends. We have relationship. You call me, even if I'm at work, I'm just going to say, hey, I'll call you back. It's never a bother.
Right.
It's hard to sort of consider that people would give me the same in return. I don't know why, but it is.
Well, that's your moment of vulnerability right now, sharing that, noticing it.
Yeah.
And just letting it be. You don't have to have it all solved.
I still hate it. I'm so sweaty right now.
Yeah. Well, it just, can you get to the place of, because hate's a strong word. And I feel like within hate, there's like resistance. So can it be a bit of it just, that's what it is? And like.
Yeah, you're right. Hate is probably not the right way to name it.
Yeah.
Because 1000%, especially given sort of recent life experiences and like moments and situations I've been in, I know that the life I deserve is on the other side of being vulnerable. So I don't hate it. I just wish that I was better at it. I wish I didn't have such resistance to it.
Yeah.
I always tell, especially like my nieces and nephews, I always tell them the way people respond and the things that they say have more to do with that person than you. And so for me, it's very clear for me to say I hate vulnerability. It says a lot about my relationship with it.
Yeah.
And maybe the difficulty that I have with working through that process.
And I think where we both are, I think just probably different parts along the way is like learning to have a relationship with vulnerability, to kind of be in conversation with it, essentially, to figure out how to kind of move with it, move through it.
Elizabeth Gilbert in Big Magic talks, it's not vulnerability. Maybe it's fear.
It's fear.
Where she says like, you're not going to stop me from taking this trip. You're going to ride shotgun with me.
Absolutely.
And you're either going to come along or you're going to get gone. I mean, she didn't say it in those such Southern terms, but maybe vulnerability is the same way.
Yeah.
Like it will be, especially for the things in life that we all want, like the big things, it will always sort of be there. And our call to action is to not run away.
Yes.
Is not run away.
Yes.
For me, maybe specifically in relationship and like new partners, recognizing that this is a vulnerable moment for me. And that doesn't make it wrong. And it doesn't mean that I should say nothing. I think sometimes being quiet about things is a way that I sort of shy away from vulnerability. And so being able to articulately name what I'm feeling and have the courage to say that, to me, is a big win. I don't always win in those moments, but when I can, I at least can recognize, yeah, you did it.
Yes. And just like our favorite Greek phrase, siga, siga, because I do think all of this, all of the ways in which we are developing as human beings, it all compounds.
It does.
And I think that this experience, that my life experience that I've had, I'm a little bit further along the path. And I see it for you. You're on it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how old we are, except we're all in different kind of journeys and different timelines. But the rewards that have come out of my most vulnerable moments could be life-changing, have been life-changing, And so, but it's scary because we can get too attached to a future or an outcome. And if we could just kind of draw ourselves back to the here and the now, which that's always the work.
Something you said earlier gave me the idea of this sort of boss babe mentality. That wasn't the first phrase I wanted to say, but I feel like for my younger cousins who are listening, we'll just call it boss babe. You can figure another B word to fit in that phrase as well.
Okay. I'm like, where's this going? Go ahead.
But this idea, especially in my 20s, I felt like I had to be tough in order to get the job done.
Oh, this resonates.
And I think if anyone knows me, you sort of know that I'm not very tough at all from a boss babe mentality. Yeah, I can do all these things, but where I thrive is being soft and being squishy and being emotional and being a feeling person. And so when I do have these moments of vulnerability and I let myself soften into loving someone or soften into finding passion and caring about something, I so feel connected to who I am. And I think that is probably a great indication that for most of my 20s, I sort of felt like I was living a life that wasn't mine. Because I thought I felt like I had to be tough. I had to do all these things. I had to not let people think that I cared about stuff. I had to be the decision maker all the time, which I do in my normal life, but it comes from a different place now. It isn't forced. It isn't from a scarcity mindset. It isn't fear. Because if I'm not this way, people won't love me. Now I feel that I'm starting to settle into that soft place. And for me, that's what vulnerability is. It allows me to live in this box to say, I do need help. I would like someone to take care of these things for me. I actually like having some decisions made for me. So when I say I don't care what we do, I really don't. But if I'm supposed to be this really strong person who makes all the decision and has all the answers, then I can be. But that's not where I operate at my highest and best. That's what vulnerability allows me. That's why I say I don't hate it. I just know it's something I have to work on.
Yeah. Yeah, the 20s, that resonated a lot. I think it's who I was in my family, the type of work I chose. I was always the leader. It was that whole like hold it all together. I mean, I think back to my store manager days. I was struggling at some points and I was like, no way, don't tell anybody. And, here's the other thing too. I look at, different genders and stuff too. Like I say that in a sense of like, I was the solo female in a group of male managers. And I did have this edge to me of like, I've always been able to kind of hang with the boys and I could take it and I can toughen up and I don't cry. Like, I got this, this like toughness that I had and it just, I got to show them after proving. And, so yeah, I talk about like, around being around males, but also too, there's the patriarchy that we have been steeped in. So there was this like, go hard, go fast, have it all figured out, and like emotions, they don't factor into anything. So it's interesting that you said that because that definitely resonated with me. And I really felt like I was like the work me and then there was a personal me and they just didn't always match up. And I think about who I was and how I operated and sometimes how I spoke to people was not how the authentic Landra would be. So yeah, that resonates so much. And I think, maybe this is like it could be a nurture versus nature thing. I also think it's just a learning over time and experiences, getting out of that environment and, just choosing different lines of work and doing all the personal development, communication work on myself has gotten me to that place of being, like you said, softer.
And I think it can be different things. Vulnerability doesn't have to be soft for everyone, but I think that's something that you and I share.
Well, and it's interesting because when we say soft, though, I think it takes a lot of courage
and strength
to be vulnerable. So it's funny we're talking soft. I think we mean soft maybe or in relation to emotions.
Maybe it just means something maybe it's totally different to the both of us, but it's still how we both describe it.
Yeah.
And again, I think that sort of practice of figuring out how to describe things, what feels right for you, what is the name of what you're feeling. I think that's a great practice. I wanted to mention, because you brought up the gender difference, I think in some respect, we don't give men any space to be vulnerable. I'm seeing this currently in some of the situations that I'm facing around male friends who don't even have have no toolkit on how to describe what they're feeling or what they're facing and what they're going through. So they just don't. But I can see that the desire is there, want to speak on something, but they don't know how, because our culture doesn't say that men should be vulnerable, because vulnerability is seen as a weakness.
Right.
But clearly it takes strength to be vulnerable. And I think it's something we should all be aware of, especially as we start to identify with whom can I be vulnerable. It's a two-way street. If I feel safe to be vulnerable with you, then you deserve the safety to be vulnerable with me. We both had the luxury of growing up with fathers who cried.
True.
And so for me, seeing a man cry doesn't rock my world. To be a man doesn't mean you don't cry, you don't feel emotion, which is, I think, one of the greatest gifts you can give, especially girls.
Oh, yeah.
I think our dads were the antithesis of toxic masculinity. 100%.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think we have to be willing to confront whatever it is that society and culture tells us a man is. In moments of vulnerability, when we ask that of men, we have to be ready to hold space for whatever comes back. Because it may be anger at first, because they've spent 40 years being unable to describe things. It may be tears because no one's ever held space before. But whatever it is, in the safety of that space, I think we have to be ready. We have to be willing to go there because we're asking the same.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just finding that harmony and that balance as human beings, and that we all possess, whether we want to name them soft skills, hard skills, masculine, feminine, they are intertwined in every one of our human beingness. Whatever our gender is, we are a mix of all these things.
The yin and the yang, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things that I have started to identify, especially in moving to Greece and having sort of this change in lifestyle, one of the things that I've identified is that the busier I was, the less I was able to pay attention to the small moments of joy. And I think for me, my busyness came from this place of scarcity. I wanted to fill every moment of my day with something because I wasn't willing to confront certain things. I wasn't willing to be vulnerable with myself, to give myself the truth of what I knew was sort of happening in my life. And I think one of the ways we can practice vulnerability is paying attention to the ordinary. One of the things that Brené Brown says is that somehow an ordinary life has become synonymous with a meaningless life.
Ooh.
And it's in the ordinary moments where we find oftentimes the most joy.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the ordinary moments that make up a lifetime.
Yeah. No, I'm going, ooh, because, sitting in this place of literally sitting in my house for long periods of time, this word contentment has been one that's been on my mind a lot. So not filling my time, like you said, all the time with, like I said, I've been going to movies and podcasts and Instagram. And then I've been like pulling back a little bit and finding, the okayness just in the moment with less is more. And just like the sitting, I don't know whether it's like, physically going through something like a book had seen, I have a picture book here, actually, is one about San Francisco. I was kind of going back through memory lane, essentially. So looking at that, right? When's the last time you've taken a book and just looking at pictures and kind of just for the, thumb through it? Then it's like sitting outside with a drink and just watching the neighbors and all the things happening around, just kind of just being with that like okayness. And I think you were kind of giving people ideas on what to do. I think that's a beautiful thing, is like not filling your time, learning how to be with yourself, cultivate that relationship with self.
I was on a phone with a friend the other day back in the US. And so time different. It was nighttime here and daytime there. And I heard birds chirping. And I thought, oh, how nice. And then I thought, wait, I hear birds chirping here every day. Why is it nice there and not nice here? Just had this moment where I was like, oh, I'm so wrapped up in my everyday sort of busyness that I'm missing these ordinary moments. There is sort of a list of things that we can do to embrace vulnerability. We can honor what's ordinary. We can allow ourselves to be seen. We can love with our whole heart. We can practice gratitude. We can lean into joy. And I think it all stems from a belief that each of us is enough and worthy of connection and belonging.
We wrapped up another serving of Biscuits and Sunshine. As always, we wouldn't be here without our amazing team of supporters and cheerleaders. And we wouldn't be here without you. If you're listening to us on Spotify, make sure to fill out the survey questions associated with this episode. We love your feedback.
Our hope for you this week is to find moments where you're able to embrace vulnerability, both big and small, starting with yourself and maybe extending it to those in your circle who deserve it.
If you love what we're serving up, be sure to subscribe and rate us on your favorite streaming platform. Also, head over to Instagram and give us a follow at Biscuits and Sunshine, all spelled out. This is Biscuits and Sunshine with Callie and Landra.